The Atchafalaya Basin's air is a real thing. In the year 1825, it was a heavy, wet blanket made from the smells of rotting plants, sweet jasmine, and the coppery smell of brackish water. For Constable Thomas Landry and his two deputies, it was the breath of a monster they had been sent to fight. For weeks, stories had been coming out of the swamp like slow, bleeding wounds. Stories of travelers who had gone missing and strange quiet where a busy inn should be. The place was called Lorbeau's Repose, which means the Crow's Rest, but lately people who went there never seemed to be able to rest. They just disappeared into the Louisiana wilderness. Landry's mission came about because of pressure from New Orleans. A wealthy merchant's son was the latest person to die because of the inn's bad reputation. The inn came into view as their flat-bottomed boat scraped against the muddy bank. It looked like a horrible shadow against the bruised twilight sky. It was a 2-story building made of dark cypress that sat on thick stilts that sank into the bog like bones. A single, unlit lantern swung gently in the humid breeze on a sagging porch that went all the way around it. The first thing that made them feel strange was the silence. There were no sounds of life, like laughter, music, or plates clattering. There was only the buzzing of bugs and the sad, far-off call of a loon. It wasn't the peaceful silence. It was the deathly silence of a place that had eaten too many secrets and was now sleeping deeply. Landry pulled out his flintlock pistol, and the sound of the hammer clicking was too loud. He had looked into a lot of cold case files before, but this one felt different. This was like stepping into a folk tale, a secret story that scared kids told in hushed tones. He was trespassing on cursed ground, and he could feel the eyes of the swamp itself watching his every move. Landry stepped onto the causeway, a rickety boardwalk of rotting planks that connected the shore to the inn. His deputies stood on either side of him. The wood made a wet, squelching groan with every step, as if the path itself was in pain. The front door of Lorbeau's Repose was open, and a dark, gaping mouth invited them into the belly of the beast. Landry pushed it open, revealing a common room shrouded in gloom. There were thick cobwebs hanging from the rafters like funeral shrouds, and a thin layer of green mildew covered the tables and chairs. An overturned tankard lay on the floor, its contents long since evaporated, leaving a dark, ugly stain on the wood. The air inside was even more stifling, thick with the smell of stagnant water, wood smoke, and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet that made the hairs on Landry's arms stand on end. He moved deeper into the shadows, his boots sticking to the grimy floor. On the hearth, a pot of what might have once been stew was now a solid mass of black mold. Everything was perfectly still, a macabre tableau of abandonment. No one had lived here in a while, but the cold that ran down Landry's spine wasn't because of the empty space. It was because he felt like the inn's residents hadn't just left, they had disappeared, just like their guests. His deputy, a young man named Benoit, pointed a trembling finger towards the corner of the room. There, half hidden beneath a collapsed section of the floor, was a waterlogged travel trunk. It was a fine piece of luggage, bound in leather and reinforced with brass. Benoit used the barrel of his rifle to pull it out of the mud. The locks were rusted shut, but the wood was so rotten that the lid broke open with a sickening crack. There was a silver locket inside that was completely clean and untouched by the surrounding decay. It shone in the dim light. Benoit gave Landry the locket. It felt cold to the touch, as if it had absorbed the chill of the grave itself. The silver was carved with a picture of a weeping willow, which is a symbol of grief and remembrance that seemed very fitting for this place. He opened it with a quick flick of his thumb. There were 2 small pictures inside. One was of a good-looking young man with serious eyes and a confident smile. The other was of a beautiful young woman with auburn hair and a soft look, Landry's blood ran cold. He knew them right away. Antoine Dubois, the merchant's son, and Isabel, his new wife. The fact that they were missing was the only reason he was here. It was the only thing that made the police take action. They had been missing for 6 months, last seen on their way to St. Martinville, heading toward Lorbeau's Repose. The official story was that they had been attacked by swamp bandits or had just gotten lost in the dangerous Bayou Maze. But this locket, which was found in the middle of the crumbling inn, told a different, scarier story. They hadn't just passed through, they had stayed, and something here had taken them. This discovery changed the scene from a simple case of abandonment to a possible crime scene, a disturbing cold case that was getting colder by the second. The inn was no longer just an empty building. It was a tomb, a place where terrible things happened. What had gone on in these 4 walls? Where were the Dubois family, the innkeepers who were supposed to give tired travelers a place to rest? And how many other secrets, how many other lockets and keepsakes of the dead were hidden under the floorboards and buried in the thick mud of the Louisiana swamp? The strange mystery of Lorbeau's Repose was just starting to come to light. We need to go back to 1821, 4 years ago, to see how horrible Lorbeau's Repose became. The Louisiana Purchase was still fresh in people's minds, and the area was a wild, untamed frontier. The Atchafalaya Basin was the darkest part of it, with 1 million acres of cypress swamp, winding waterways, and marsh that couldn't be crossed. It was a necessary evil for travelers, a huge roadblock on the way from the busy port of New Orleans to the growing towns in the west. It was a big risk to cross it. There were many dangers: poisonous snakes, huge alligators, fogs that could swallow a person whole, and groups of ruthless highwaymen who used the swamp's maze-like nature to their advantage. In a world full of danger and uncertainty, the sudden appearance of an inn was nothing short of a miracle. Silas Dubois built Lorbeau's Repose. He was as old and worn out as the cypress trees that grew around his property. He was a former fur trapper from French Canada who had lived in the toughest conditions his whole life. He was tall and thin, with a lot of iron-gray hair and eyes that looked like they were always in the shadow of the swamp. He didn't say much, and when he did, it was a low growl, like mud moving. In a lot of ways, his wife Elodie was the opposite of him. She was short and looked weak, and she was quiet and religious. People knew her for her amazing cooking, especially her savory meat pies, which were said to be able to bring the soul of the most tired traveler back to life. Along with their 2 eerily quiet kids, Jean and Amalie, they looked like a hard-working family on the frontier making a living in the harsh wilderness. They promised a warm bed, a hot meal, and a safe place to stay in a world that was always dangerous, or so it seemed. The inn quickly became known among the merchants, land surveyors, and pioneers who crossed the swamp. It was the only sign of civilization for 50 miles in any direction. A single light in a sea of darkness. The building itself was an amazing feat of frontier engineering. It was built on a small piece of solid ground and raised on huge stilts to keep it safe from the seasonal floods that turned the basin into a huge inland sea. Silas said that he got the name Le Corbeau's Repose from a dream. He said that crows, which are smart and watchful birds, had shown him where to build. The inn worked like any other for the first year. People came and went, leaving with full bellies and stories of how quiet and welcoming the Dubois family was. They talked about how Silas knew everything there was to know about the swamp's secret paths and how Elodie's pies were so good that they were like miracles. They talked about how strange the kids were. The boy, Jean, was as strong as a man and never smiled. The girl, Amalie, would sit on the porch for hours humming a song that didn't sound right to a doll made of twigs and human hair. But travelers were very superstitious, and the strange things that a family living in such deep isolation did were easily written off as harmless oddities. They thought the swamp changed people because it required a certain level of toughness and a lack of concern for the rules of polite society. No one asked why the Dubois family never seemed to run out of supplies, even though they lived far away. People didn't wonder how Elodie got the dark, rich meat for her famous pies. They were just thankful for the safe place to rest, even if it was only for a short time, away from the horrors that were just outside the lantern light. They paid their money, slept under a solid roof, and then left the next morning, completely unaware of the horrible truth that was starting to grow inside the walls of the Crow's Rest. The first known disappearance happened in the fall of 1822. Jacques Fournier was the man's name. He was a rich fur trader from St. Louis who was known for wearing a heavy belt of gold coins to carry his money. He was an experienced traveler who couldn't easily get lost or be surprised. A letter to his business partner said that his last known location was Lorbeau's Repose. He said he would stay one night to rest his horse before making the last push to New Orleans. No one ever saw him again. When someone asked weeks later, Silas Dubois was polite but not helpful. Of course, he remembered the man. He was a big, loud guy. Silas said he had left at dawn, looking rested and ready to go. He said that Fournier probably ran into the famous gang of river pirates led by Jean Lafitte's former lieutenant. Or maybe his horse fell into a sinkhole. The swamp, he said with a gravelly sigh, had 1,000 ways of claiming a man. It made sense. The authorities didn't have much reason or resources to keep pushing the issue. It wasn't unusual for a single man to disappear in the vastness of the Atchafalaya. It was a sad event, but it happened a lot. The case was closed, and the file was put away as yet another person who had died in the harsh wilderness. But then, a few months later, a single surveyor heading west disappeared in almost the same way. The inn was the last place he was seen. Once more, Silas told a believable, if old, story about the dangers of the swamp. This pattern, this terrible rhythm of people going missing, had begun. Travelers would come tired and thankful for a place to stay. The quiet Silas and the happy Elodie would greet them. They would eat her rich, tasty pies and sleep in a clean bed. Then they would leave, their lives erased, and their stories would end suddenly at the door of the Swamp Inn. As more people went missing, a slow, creeping fear began to poison the inn's reputation. In the beginning, the stories were just whispers, bits of conversation shared in quiet tones in the coffee shops of New Orleans and the bars of Baton Rouge. The swampy area around the inn was called the Bassin Perdu, which means lost basin. Experienced guides started to change their routes, adding days to their trips just to stay away from the dark shadow of Lorbeau's Repose. The inn began to mix with the region's already rich folklore, which was full of scary stories. People talked about the Feu Follet, which were ghostly lights that were said to lead travelers off the path and into the deadly embrace of the bog. Some people said that Silas Dubois could use illegal magic to call these lights and bring people to his door without them knowing. People whispered about the loup-garou, the Cajun werewolf, saying that the Dubois family had to live alone because they were hiding a terrible cursed illness. These scary stories about the supernatural were almost comforting. They gave me a way to make sense of things that didn't make sense. It was easier to believe in legendary monsters than to face the fact that the monsters were actually people. The Dubois family didn't do much to stop these rumors. They actually seemed to encourage them. When people asked him questions, Silas would often talk about the dark spirits of the swamp, the old evils that lived under the water. He used the fear of the wild as a shield, a great way to throw people off his trail and make them think about the forbidden and the supernatural instead. He was able to turn the place that should have been his biggest enemy into his strongest alibi. The Dubois family's real business was a masterclass in how to be patient and use creepy creativity to get what you want. They picked their victims very carefully. They went after people who were traveling alone or in small groups, people who wouldn't be missed for weeks or even months. They looked for signs of wealth, like a nice horse, a well-made coat, or the shine of a gold watch. These were the sheep that needed to be sheared. But at least at first, their method wasn't violent or brutish. The scary part started at the dinner table. The centerpiece of their trap was Elodie's famous meat pies, which were a sign of her hospitality. People would comment on how rich they tasted and how they made them feel sleepy. A lot of people would have a hard time finishing their meal before they got too sleepy and their eyelids got heavy and their limbs felt like lead. They would stumble to their rooms, thinking they were just tired from the long trip. The secret ingredient wasn't a rare spice from the East. It was a carefully measured amount of ground Jimson weed, a strong and dangerous hallucinogen that grew wild in the swamp's darker areas. Elodie knew a lot about the plant because her grandmother had taught her folk remedies. In small amounts, it caused a deep, paralyzing sleep that left the victim completely helpless. The Dubois family had made a perfect trap for predators that looked like a safe place to stay. We need to look more closely at the inn itself to see how truly disturbing their methods are. And if you find these forbidden stories as interesting as we do, you should think about subscribing to The Sealed Room. The secrets hidden under the floorboards are much worse than any rumor. The building style of Lorbeau's Repose was an important part of how scary it was. The guest rooms were on the second floor, right above the bayou's dark, murky waters that flowed under the inn. There was a rope bed, a wash basin, and a single wooden chair in each room. But Silas Dubois had built a truly evil machine under the rough floorboards. There was a big part of the floor under each bed that wasn't nailed down. It was actually a hinged trapdoor that could be opened from a secret corridor that ran the length of the second story. It was held in place by a single strong iron bolt. The family would wait until the middle of the night, when the swamp was full of the sounds of its nighttime creatures, which would cover up any other sounds after a guest had eaten Elodie's drugged pie and fallen into a stupor. Then Silas and his big son, Jean, would move quietly and with skill. They would go into the secret hallway, which was only as wide as a man's shoulders. They would find the bolt under the chosen room and slide it back with a well-oiled click. The trapdoor would swing open, and the guest, who was sleeping and wrapped in their bed linens, would fall silently into the cold, dark water below. There was no scream or fight, just one muffled splash that the swamp's vast, indifferent darkness quickly swallowed. The smell and the noise would bring the alligators, who would do the rest. The crime was perfect. The inn was the murder weapon, and the evidence was quickly and permanently eaten by the ecosystem that the Dubois family called their partner in crime. The family's methodical way of doing things was scary. The work wasn't done yet after the guest had left. Elodie and the young Amalie would go through the victim's things while Silas and Jean worked on the sad job upstairs. They weren't just common thieves who stole things from bags. Their method was much more organized and scary. Everything was put in order. A locked chest under the hearth held coins, jewelry, and weapons. Clothes were carefully cleaned, repaired, and put away. Any letters, journals, or other identifying documents were quickly burned in the kitchen stove. The ashes were then mixed into the embers until there was nothing left. Elodie ran her home in a strange way that was like frugality on the frontier. She didn't throw anything away. Fine leather from the boots of a victim could be used to fix Silas's suspenders. A merchant's wife might be able to cut down a silk dress and make a new dress for Amalie's creepy doll. The horses of the missing travelers were taken deep into the swamp along a secret path and sold at a market 100 miles away, where there were no rules and no questions were asked. The Dubois family could live in relative comfort and be completely self-sufficient because of this terrible cycle of murder and recycling. They were a separate kingdom that preyed on the world that passed by their door. The kid's part in this whole thing was the most upsetting part. Gene, the son, did what he was told without saying a word or showing any emotion. But Amali, the daughter, seemed to enjoy her work like a child. Later, people who almost died at the inn said that the little girl hummed strange songs while she sorted through a traveler's saddlebags or played with a silver locket that wasn't hers. The Dubois kids had never known any other kind of life than this one. Murder was just another thing to do around the house. The Dubois family terrorized people for almost 2 years without anyone stopping them. The swamp was good at keeping secrets, but they messed up in the spring of 1824. Klaus Richter, a German naturalist, was in Louisiana gathering rare orchids that only grew in the deepest parts of the Atchafalaya. Richter was a scientist who paid close attention to details. He was also very careful and kept a detailed journal of his travels, observations, and suspicions every day. He got to Lorbeau's Repose on a stormy afternoon and was thankful for the shelter. The Dubois family welcomed him, and, like so many others before him, gave him one of Elodie's famous pies. Richter, on the other hand, was a botanist and immediately noticed the Jimson weed's slightly bitter, metallic aftertaste. He had learned about the plant and how it could paralyze people. He pretended to be tired and went to his room, where he was terrified. He knew he had been drugged. He knew he had to get away, but he also knew that facing Silas and his strong son head-on would be the end of him. He had to be smart. He lay in bed and fought the paralysis that was slowly taking over his body. He listened, trying to hear over the rain and the pounding of his heart. His room, like the others, looked out over the bayou. He was lying there pretending to be asleep when he felt a slight draft coming from under the bed. It was a small thing, but in his heightened state of fear it was a clue that saved his life. Why would a solid floor let in a draft? Richter's scientific mind fought through the drug's fog. He carefully rolled off the bed, moving slowly and on purpose. He crawled on his hands and knees and felt around the edges of the floorboards under the bed frame. He was right. They weren't safe. He could feel a clear seam, a hidden edge. He had found the trap. He felt sick when he realized how horrible this place really was. It wasn't a hotel. It was a slaughterhouse. He realized then that the stories he had heard weren't just made-up stories. They were sad, understated truths. The family wasn't just stealing from their guests. They were killing them one by one. He had to leave. His window was the only way out. It was a straight drop of 10 feet into the water below, which was full of alligators and churning. It was a leap into death, but staying in the room would have meant certain death. He saw something in the stormy dark that confirmed all of his fears. He saw a pile of broken things on the other side of the bayou, lit up by a flash of lightning. There was a broken wagon wheel, a rotting saddle, and the metal frame of a pair of glasses shining in the mud. It was a pile of trash from the dead, a reminder of the inn's many silent victims. At that moment, he heard the faint sound he had been dreading, the soft scrape of a bolt being pulled back from the other side of the wall. There wasn't enough time to think anymore. Klaus Richter jumped out of the window with a desperate prayer, and as he did, the floor beneath his bed opened up into a gaping hole. He had gotten away from the trap, but now he was in the swamp, hurt, confused, and being hunted. People heard the splash when Richter's body hit the water. A loud, guttural shout came from the inn, and then heavy boots could be heard on the porch. Silas and Jean knew that their target had gotten away from the main trap. They looked around the bayou with the lantern light cutting through the rain. Richter's leg was badly broken from the fall, and the murky water was pulling him under. He was a scientist, not a frontiersman, but his basic survival instinct took over. He went underwater and held his breath until his lungs hurt. Then he let the current take him downstream, away from the lights that were looking for him. He could hear them launching a pirogue, the boat scraping against the wooden dock, and their angry voices cutting through the storm. For the rest of the night, a scary game of cat and mouse played out in the twisting waterways. Richter was in a lot of pain and cold as he hid among the tangled roots of cypress trees while the Dubois men looked for him. He could hear them calling to each other in low, guttural sounds that sounded like the language of predators. He saw their lantern move across the water, its beam a searching, evil eye. He knew that if they found him, he would die slowly and painfully. The storm and the darkness were strangely enough on his side. He was able to get himself onto a small muddy island and hide in a thicket of palmettos. He watched Silas and Jean finally give up their search and paddle back to the inn, their faces grim with failure, just as the sun was starting to rise. Richter was alive, but he was stuck deep in the heart of the Atchafalaya with a broken leg and the terrible knowledge of what Lorbeau's repose really was. His troubles were far from over. Klaus Richter lived on his gut for 3 days. He used vines and a piece of driftwood to make a splint for his broken leg. He ate bugs and drank swamp water, which tasted bad but kept him alive. Every time a twig broke or the water rippled, he felt a new wave of fear. The faces of the Dubois family kept coming back to him. Silas's cold, dead eyes, Jean's brutish silence, Elodie's fake sweetness, and little Amali's creepy humming. He knew they would be watching the rivers and lakes, looking for a mistake he would make. He only traveled at night, crawling and dragging himself through the mud as he painfully moved away from the cursed inn. Finally, on the 4th day, a pair of Cajun trappers found him. He was delirious from pain and hunger. They took him in, bandaged his wounds, and listened with wide eyes to his terrible story. Of course, they had heard the rumors about the inn, but they had thought they were just stories. Richter's detailed first-hand account was a whole other thing. It was a statement from someone who had died. He showed them his journal, where he had written down everything, even his thoughts about the drugged pie and how he found the trap door. The trappers knew the local constable was lazy and not very good at his job, so they decided to take Richter and his journal straight to the police in New Orleans. The dark secret of the Swamp Inn was finally going to come to light. The trip was long and hard, and when they finally got to the city, Richter was very sick from being exposed to the elements. But he kept going, driven by one goal: to see justice done and to make sure that no one else ever had to deal with the terrible hospitality of the Dubois family. The city magistrate in New Orleans was horrified and skeptical when Klaus Richter's testimony came across his desk. It seemed too strange and Gothic to be true that a respectable innkeeper family was killing their guests with trapdoors and drugged pies. It sounded like a bad penny dreadful book, not a reliable account from a witness. Richter's detailed journal, along with the growing list of famous people who had gone missing in the Atchafalaya, was enough to start an official investigation. The magistrate had to do something because the city's rich merchants, who had lost sons and business partners to the swamp, were putting pressure on him. He sent Constable Thomas Landry, a man known for being honest and never giving up, to lead an expedition to Lorbeau's repose and find out the truth once and for all. This takes us back to the beginning of our story, when Landry and his deputies were standing in the empty, falling-apart inn. But now that I had Richter's terrifying story, the scene took on a new, darker meaning. The cobwebs weren't just signs that the place had been left behind. They were the work of spiders in a web that was big enough for a person to fit in. The dirt on the floor wasn't just dirt. It was the dirt from a lot of crimes that had been forgotten. The sweet smell of metal in the air was the ghost of blood that had been spilled. Landry now understood. He wasn't just looking into a string of disappearances. He was in the middle of a family-run business that had been killing people for years without getting caught. Finding the locket that belonged to the merchant's son was the last thing he needed to be sure. Everything that Klaus Richter said in his story was true and terrible. Landry began a thorough search of the inn with a grim sense of purpose. He wasn't looking for survivors anymore. He was looking for proof that people had died. He told his deputies to search every dark corner of the cursed property, including the grounds, the outbuildings, and the smokehouse. He went back to the second floor, to the guest rooms where so many people had slept for the last time without knowing it. He went to the room that Richter wrote about in his journal. He moved the bed frame out of the way and looked at the floorboards. There was a clear seam, just like the naturalist had said. He put the pry bar from his saddlebag into the crack and pushed it up. A big part of the floor swung down with a groan of rusty hinges, showing a dark, gaping hole. Landry looked into the empty space. There was no solid ground below him. Instead, there was the black swirling water of the bayou. He could see the dark shapes of logs, or maybe they were alligators, slowly moving with the current. He thought about how horrible it would be for the victims to be drugged and unable to move as they fell into that cold, watery grave. He couldn't say anything because it was such a simple, effective, and terrifying way to kill someone. He went from room to room and found the same evil structure in each one. The whole second floor of the inn was a place where people could be killed. The only reason it was built was to lure, trap, and kill people. Landry was most disturbed by how cold-blooded and planned everything was. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was a trade that had been learned over years of practice. The Dubois family didn't just kill people. They were death artists. While Landry was up there finding something terrible, his deputy Benoit was looking through the smokehouse. It looked like any other smokehouse on a homestead in the West. But inside, the air was thick with a strange, sickly sweet smell that mixed with the smell of hickory smoke. There were rows of cured meats hanging from the ceiling, including hams, sausages, and pieces of what looked like venison. Benoit found something that didn't belong in the back, behind a pile of firewood. There was a pile of neatly folded clothes on a makeshift shelf. There were shirts for men, dresses for women, and even a small coat for a child. They were all clean and well-mended, as if waiting for their owners to return. Beneath the clothes was a small wooden box. Benoit found a disturbing collection of personal items inside: a pair of glasses with a cracked lens, a silver-backed hairbrush with auburn hair still stuck in its bristles, a leather-bound Bible with the name Eleanor Vance written on the inside cover, and a dozen other trinkets and keepsakes. It was a pirate's treasure chest, but the treasure was the memories of dead people that had been stolen. It was a terrifying, gruesome record of the inn's victims. Each object told the story of a life cut short, a journey that ended in this horrible place. Benoit felt sick all over. The real horror of the scene wasn't just the things themselves, but how well they had been kept. This wasn't the work of a regular thief. It was the work of a collector, someone who hoards lives. The Dubois family didn't just steal their victims' money, they also took a piece of their identity, which was a sick trophy of their kill. The search went on, and each new find was worse than the last. Morrow, the second deputy, who was a stoic veteran, looked into the kitchen. At first, it looked pretty normal. There were pots and pans hanging by the fire, and sacks of cornmeal and flour were stacked against the wall. But Morrow had a hunter's eye for things that didn't belong. He saw that the stone floor in the pantry wasn't level. One of the flagstones was a little higher than the others, and its edges were clean of the dirt that had built up on the others. He used his bayonet to pry it up. There was a dark, square hole, and a wooden ladder going down to a small root cellar below it. The air that came out of the hole was cold and bad-smelling, like rotten wood and wet dirt. Morrow lit a lantern and went down into the dark. The cellar was small and cramped, and the walls were lined with shelves that held jars of pickled vegetables and preserves, but there was a heavy, iron-bound chest against the wall. There was no lock on it. Morrow took a deep breath and lifted the heavy lid. He didn't find gold or silver inside. Instead, he found something much more useful to his investigation, and much scarier. Ledgers. The kind of thing an innkeeper would use to keep track of guests and costs. But when Morrow opened the first one, he saw that these were not normal account books. They were records of deaths. Each entry was a detailed record of a guest, including their name, or a description if their name was unknown, where they were from, a list of their valuables, and a scary last column called Date of Harvest. The last entry was for Antoine and Isabelle Dubois, the merchant's son and his bride. It was 6 months ago that they were harvested. The ledger was a cold, planned record of their crimes, a business-like record of how they made money by selling people. Morrow took one of the ledgers out of the cellar and into the common room. His face was pale and serious. He gave it to Landry, who read the entries in shock and silence. There were dozens of names, going back over 2 years. It was mind-boggling. No one was safe, not even merchants, priests, soldiers, or families with kids. The Dubois family preyed on everyone equally. The ledgers showed just how big and scary their business really was. This wasn't just a few random murders for profit. It was a planned, ongoing campaign of murder for profit. Landry felt like he had failed in a big way. He was a lawman who had sworn to protect the innocent. But this family had been running a death factory right in front of him for years without fear of punishment. The law didn't fail these people. It just didn't see what was going to happen to them. As he turned the brittle pages, he saw a series of disturbing notes in the margins written in a soft, almost childlike handwriting. Amalie wrote them, not Silas or Elodie. There were small, rough drawings of a bird, a flower, and a star next to some of the names, and next to some of them, very simple notes that made me shiver. Pretty hair, shiny buttons, and cried for his mama. The most disturbing thing I found was how casually and innocently cruel these notes were. They showed that the person who did the murders didn't just help them. They also saw the victims as objects or toys. The whole family had a deep, serious illness of the soul. They were a group of monsters that were perfectly suited to their predatory environment. They were the spiders in the middle of the web that was the inn. The most horrible question was still in the air, even though none of the 3 men asked it. What happened to the bodies? The trapdoors and alligators were a very effective way to get rid of bodies, but was that all there was to it? Landry's thoughts went back to the smokehouse and the rows of cured meats. He remembered Elodie's famous pies, which had made the inn known for being friendly. He started to have a sickening, forbidden thought that was so horrible that he could barely bring himself to think about it. He thought of Klaus Richter's journal, where he wrote that the pie had a rich, dark meat that was different from other meats. He remembered the trappers who had first saved Richter, saying that the Dubois family never seemed to need to hunt or buy animals, even though the meat they served was very good. The pieces started to fit together, making a picture of unimaginable horror. Is it possible? Could their evil go that far? Landry looked at his deputies, whose faces were pale and haunted in the light of the lantern. He could see the same terrible doubt in their eyes. The Dubois family hadn't just killed their guests and taken their things. They hadn't just fed them to the swamp creatures. They had done the worst thing possible to them. Not only was murder the last horrible secret of Lorbeau's repose, but so was cannibalism. The pies that had lured their victims into a drugged sleep were made from the bodies of people who had died before them. The constables thought they were ready for the worst, but what really happened was something so twisted that they could never have imagined it. For over 100 years, what they found in the cellar would be illegal to make public. We are now opening these records for you and will keep doing so every week for our subscribers. This is because the sealed room was created to unlock the darkest parts of history. Landry, now filled with a cold, angry certainty, took his men back to the kitchen and the smokehouse for a second, more thorough search. They weren't just looking for proof of murder anymore. They were looking for proof of the unthinkable. They found a smaller group of clay jars in the pantry, behind the jars of pickled vegetables. These jars were sealed with wax. They opened one and smelled something horrible and rotten. Inside was a preserved substance that was disturbingly familiar. It was rendered fat, human fat. Morrow used his knife to cut a piece off of one of the hams that were hanging in the smokehouse. The texture was off. The muscle's grain was finer than any deer or hog he had ever butchered. There was no longer any doubt. The terrible truth was confirmed. Le Corbeau's repose was more than just an inn, a trap, and a tomb. It was also a pantry. The Dubois family was feeding their victims to their future victims. This created a cycle of death and consumption that was both efficient and terrible. The guests who complimented Elodie's cooking were unknowingly eating the same people they might have seen on the road days before. It was a level of evil that no one could understand. A fall into a kind of evil so deep that it seemed to belong to the darkest of forbidden stories, not to the world of men. The investigation was over now. Landry and his men had found a story of crime so terrible that it would leave a mark on the history of this land forever. They had discovered the trap's workings, the dead's ledgers, the killer's trophies, and the horrible proof of their last desecration. But there was still one big question. Where was the Dubois family? The inn was empty, but there were no signs of a fight or a quick exit. It was like they had just melted back into the swamp where they came from. Landry thought that Klaus Richter's escape had ruined their plans. Their system had been perfect for years. No victim had ever lived to tell the tale. Silas and his family must have known that their secret was out when Richter got away. They must have known that the outside world would soon be coming for them. It would be days, maybe even weeks, before anyone did anything about Richter's story. They had enough time to pack up their most valuable things, like the chest of coins and jewelry, and leave. But where could they go? For any other family, it would be impossible to disappear without a trace, but the Dubois family was different. They were swamp creatures. The treacherous, maze-like Atchafalaya was a death trap for other people, but it was their safe place, their backyard. Silas knew all of its secret islands, hidden passages, and forgotten corners where no lawman would ever dare to go. They hadn't run away from the swamp. Instead, they had gone deeper into its embrace, back to the heart of the darkness that had shaped them. Landry knew that trying to find the Dubois family in the depths of the basin would be a waste of time. It would be a death sentence. At the edge of the known waterways, he lost all power and even his life. There was a world beyond that where men like him didn't make it, but men like Silas did. The family always had a head start, and the swamp itself was their best friend, ready to swallow any group of people who tried to find them. The search was officially over. The Dubois family, who planned one of the most horrible and gruesome crime sprees in American history, were never caught. They disappeared from history, but they became something much stronger and longer lasting. A legend, a ghost story that will scare children and travelers for years to come. The official story was never enough for the people who lived near the swamp. They needed a more direct and physical kind of justice. A week after Landry's investigation, a group of vigilantes, men who had lost friends and family to the inn, paddled out to Lorbeau's repose. They didn't come to look for things or save them. They came to clean. They poured lantern oil all over the cursed building, from the blood-soaked floors of the guest rooms to the stilt legs that were stuck deep in the mud. They set it on fire, and the fire could be seen for miles, a bright orange fire against the black night sky. They set fire to the inn, hoping that the fire would cleanse the land and get rid of the Dubois family's evil. But some bad things can't be undone, and some stories can never be told again. The fire burned down the building, but it only made the story stronger. The story of the Butcher Inn of the Atchafalaya got bigger and bigger with each telling over the years and decades that followed. The facts of the case, which were already scary, were made even scarier by adding supernatural elements. Some people said that Silas Dubois wasn't a real person, but rather the evil spirit of the swamp taking on a physical form. They said that Elodie practiced the darkest kinds of voodoo and used her magic to lead travelers to their deaths. The kids, Jean and Amalie, became demons in the stories, wild animals that would stalk the bayou at night looking for new victims. The inn's location became a place where people weren't allowed to go. No one would build on the cursed land again. The burnt stilts stayed in the water for years, sticking out like the broken ribs of a huge animal. Finally, the swamp took them back, pulling them down into the mud. Trappers and fishermen would talk about strange things happening in the area. They said that the eerie lights, or feu follet, were more active than ever, dancing over the spot where the inn used to be. Some people said they could hear a woman's crying or a man's deep laughter carried by the wind. But the most common and scary report was the sound of a little girl humming a strange, off-key tune. This was the same tune that people said Amalie hummed to her doll made of twigs and human hair. The story turned into a warning about how easily civilization can hide evil and how thin the line is between being human and being a monster. The mystery of what happened to the Dubois family is still one of Louisiana's most famous and scary ones. Did they get away and live the rest of their lives in a far-off part of the frontier, maybe under a new name, still doing their terrible business? It's a scary thought. Or did the swamp that helped them finally kill them? Maybe their pirogue capsized in a storm. Or Silas, their stern father, finally fell victim to the dangers he knew so well. Some of the more sinister stories point to a more fittingly morbid end. One story says that they were attacked by a group of river pirates while they were trying to get away, and that the hunters became the hunted for the first time, suffering the same brutal violence they had used on so many others. Another, more popular story suggests a kind of poetic justice. It says that the family, who were starving and on the run, had to turn on each other, and that the cannibalistic habits they had learned on strangers led to their own horrible death. This version of the story, which has Shakespearean overtones of evil eating itself, is the one that people in the area have most firmly believed. It gives you a sense of closure and the belief that such a terrible evil could not last in the world. But the truth is, no one knows. The Dubois family went from being real people in history to being scary figures in folklore. Their last chapter was never written, and their final fate is a blank page that makes their story even scarier. The little bit of physical evidence that was found about the Dubois family's crimes had a strange fate. People thought the death ledgers, which coldly and carefully recorded murders, were too shocking and inflammatory to be made public. They were used in the first magistrate's report, then sealed and put away in a dusty archive in New Orleans, where they were officially banned from being seen by the public for more than 100 years. Historians and crime fans talked about them a lot and made up stories about them. It was very hard to read the official report on the Lorbeau's Repose case because it left out the most gruesome details, like the cannibalism. The people in charge at the time were afraid that the whole truth would make people panic and start a wave of vigilante violence that could bring down the whole area. They decided to bury the most disturbing parts of the story and make it into a simple tale of a family of robbers and murderers, which was scary enough on its own. The lockets, Bibles, and hairbrushes that were found in the smokehouse were kept for a while in the hope that family members would come forward to claim them, but very few did. The people who stayed at the inn were drifters, pioneers, and people on the move. Their ties to home and family were often weak at best. Eventually, these sad artifacts, The last physical traces of lives that are no longer with us were quietly thrown away, and their stories were lost forever. The history of the Swamp Inn was purposely cleaned up and kept secret. It was a chapter that the growing American society wasn't ready to read yet. What is it about a story like this that still bothers us almost 200 years later? It's not just a simple cold case or a story of violence on the frontier. The story of the Dubois family brings up a very deep, basic fear: being betrayed. An inn should be a place where people can find peace and safety during a storm. One of the oldest and most important social contracts is to offer hospitality by giving food, drink, and shelter. Not only did the Dubois family break this contract, they turned it upside down. They turned it into a weapon. They used the things that made people feel safe and comfortable as weapons of death. There was poison in the hot food. The cozy bed hid a way to death. The innkeeper's friendly smile hid the mind of a predator. This twisted version of hospitality is what makes the story so disturbing. It says that the most dangerous people aren't always the monsters that are easy to see in the dark, but the friendly, normal-looking people who invite you into their homes. It takes advantage of the fear that the hand that feeds you might also be the hand that kills you. This is the long-lasting psychological horror of Lorbeau's Repose. It's a story that makes us question the faces of strangers and wonder what dark secrets might be hidden behind the closed doors of the places we mistakenly believe are safe. The story is also a strong reminder of what life was like on the American frontier. We often think of this time as a time of brave pioneers and manifest destiny, when people heroically moved into a new world. But for every story of bravery and success, there are 100 stories of darkness, violence, and hopelessness. There wasn't much law on the frontier, and sometimes there wasn't any at all. It was a very lonely place where people in groups had to figure things out on their own, for better or worse. This isolation could make people very strong and independent, but it could also bring out the worst in people. The Dubois family could not have lived in Boston or New Orleans. Their horrible business depended completely on the fact that they lived in a place where no one followed the law. The swamp gave them the privacy they needed to commit their crimes, the tools they needed to get rid of the evidence, and the stories they needed to avoid being suspected. They were a product of their time and place, a perfect storm of human evil and geographic chance. Their story is a scary counter-narrative to the idea that progress is always good. It reminds us that the wildness of the American continent wasn't the only thing that was wild. The human soul, liberated from societal constraints and supervision, may manifest as the most ferocious wilderness of all. Elodie Dubois, the matriarch, is one of the most disturbing people in this whole creepy story. Silas was the grim face and physical enforcer of the operation, while Elodie was its quiet, beating heart. She was the one who got the dose of Jimson weed just right, making her kitchen a death shop. She was the one who learned how to butcher animals, turning human tragedy into a long-term food source. With a cold, practical efficiency, she was the one who cleaned the blood off the victims' clothes and used their things in new ways. She was the real monster in Lorbeau's Repose in a lot of ways. Silas and Jean used brute force, but Elodie's evil was based on intelligence, patience, and horrifying creativity. She is a terrifying example of a domestic predator. The hearth, the kitchen, and the traditional place where women find comfort and care were her areas of expertise. She turned these areas into the main processing unit of a murder factory. She ruined the very idea of motherhood and home life, turning acts of feeding into acts of deep desecration. Silas may have come up with the idea for the trap, but it was Elodie who set it up, took care of it, and made it so effective that it was impossible to resist. Her soft smile and religious demeanor were the best way to hide her true self. They made her look like a loving mother, but her soul was as cold and empty as a grave in winter. In these kinds of stories, the quietest characters are often the most disturbing. And what about the kids, Amali and Jean? They are the most tragic and maybe the most terrifying part of this story. How evil has become normal. They weren't born monsters. They were taught to be them. Their home was a school for murder. Their chores were stealing and desecrating, and their parents taught them how to do terrible things. Jean, the quiet and obedient son, learned to kill with the same lack of emotion that a farmer's son learns to kill a pig. He thought of it as just another part of life, something to do without question or emotion. His father's harsh lessons probably broke and reshaped his soul long before he could even understand the moral consequences of what he did. But Amali's case is more complicated and scary. Her childish notes in the death ledgers and her habit of collecting trinkets from the victims suggest that she was doing more than just following orders. They suggest that the family is actively involved in the way they see the world, even if they don't know what they're doing. She didn't see the guests as people. She saw them as a way to get new toys, stories, and shiny things. The evil around her didn't take away her innocence. It changed it, turning it into a horrible version of childhood. One of the most important and unanswered questions in the story is whether Jean and Amali could have been saved, or whether they were meant to carry on the family's terrible legacy. They show how scary it is that the worst curse isn't one that comes from a god, but one that is passed down from parent to child. Could something like the crime at Lorbeau's Repose happen now? It seems impossible in this day and age of GPS tracking, credit card transactions, and constant digital communication. In today's world, technology has made it almost impossible for someone to disappear without a trace. The Dubois family's success depended on being alone, but that is now almost completely gone. And yet the main parts of their story still ring true with modern fears. The fear of being alone in a rural area where the rules are different. The fear of a stranger who seems nice but has bad intentions. And the fear of a traveler who is alone and falls off the map. Even now, thousands of people go missing every year, and their cases get colder and colder as time goes on. The basic horror of being erased from the world stays the same, even if the methods are different. The story of the Swamp Inn is a historical anchor for this modern worry. It reminds us that even though our technology has changed, people have not. The ability to lie deeply, be violent, and be cruel in ways we can't even imagine is a part of being human that has always been there. The Dubois family may be dead, but the evil they represented will never die. It still hides in the quiet, forgotten parts of the world, waiting for the right mix of chance and solitude to come back. There is nothing left of Lorbeau's Repose today. The land has been completely taken back by the swamp. The bayou's channel has changed, and local historians and folklorists are now arguing about where the inn used to be. There are no plaques, monuments, or official recognitions of the terrible things that happened there. The only signs are the stories and whispers that still echo through the cypress groves and across the dark water. People who know the story still treat the area with a kind of superstitious respect. There aren't many people who fish or hunt there. Most boaters stay away from it, especially at night. People think it's bad luck because the air is heavy with sadness, and the water is cold with the memory of the dead. Some people say that if you listen closely on a quiet night when the moon is behind the clouds, you can still hear the faint sound of a body hitting the water. This is a sound that the swamp has recorded and plays back on an endless, terrifying loop. It is a place that will never be the same again because of the evil people it had to see. The Atchafalaya Basin is full of secrets, but the one it keeps most closely is the Swamp Inn's, a cold case that the land itself won't let go of. In the end, the story of Lorbeau's Repose raises more questions than it answers. It is a story that is lost in time and the swamp's fog. A perfect cold case where the full truth will never be known. How many people really died? The ledgers were terrifyingly detailed, but were they all there? How many nameless drifters, travelers who weren't recorded, and runaway souls died at the inn without ever being mentioned in the harvest column? The real number of dead is probably much higher than what the official record says. Only the alligators and the thick mud know what it is. And what happened to the Dubois money? They were said to have taken a chest full of gold and jewels with them, but it was never found. Is there still a cursed treasure buried deep in the swamp, waiting for someone to find it? Or was it the thing that led to their downfall, the thing that made them easy prey for other, more common predators who eventually hunted them down and killed them? The story's lasting power comes from how unclear it is. It takes away the comfort of closure and the pleasure of a neat and tidy ending. It keeps us on edge because we have to think about the loose ends and the things we don't know. The fear comes not only from what we know, but also from the huge, dark space of what we will never know. The Swamp Inn's creepy past is a true ghost story, but not because of supernatural spirits. It's haunted by the ghosts of the real people who disappeared inside its walls. The ghost of a justice that was never served haunts it. And the ghost of the Dubois family, who escaped the law and became a legend, haunts it. Their names will always be linked to a type of Gothic horror that is uniquely American. Their story is a scary reminder that the scariest monsters aren't the ones with fangs and claws from stories. They are people who look just like us, and they can smile, cook, and give us a warm bed for the night. They are the monsters that don't live in the dark corners of the forest, but in the dark corners of the human heart. The fire that destroyed Lorbo's repose may have turned the building to ash, but it could not destroy the story. The story lived on, passed down from generation to generation, a secret piece of history told in whispers on dark and stormy nights. It also reminds us that some places will always be haunted by what happened there, and that even after the bones have turned to dust and the blood has been washed away, the horror will still be there.